Nancy heard the fork hit the plate before Diane's voice cut through the room. "You stole this," Diane said, holding up an empty white envelope like it was evidence in a courtroom. Howard's cousin stopped chewing, his uncle leaned back, and the whole dining room in suburban Ohio went so quiet Nancy could hear the refrigerator hum. "That envelope had $2,000 in it," Diane added, eyes locked on Nancy's face. "And you were the last one in my office." Nancy blinked, confused, then looked at Howard as if he might explain why his mother had turned Sunday dinner into a trial. Howard's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Diane pointed again and said, "Don't act shocked. People like you always come in sweet and leave with what isn't theirs." 2 weeks earlier, things had looked normal on the outside, like they always did when Nancy tried her best to keep the peace. She cooked when they visited, laughed politely at jokes that weren't funny, and brought little gifts Diane never used but always judged. Nancy worked long hours and paid bills quietly, the way her own mother taught her. Do what's needed, don't announce it, and don't embarrass your husband by competing with his family. But Diane loved loud credit, and she treated silence like weakness, always saying, "Howard carries this marriage," even when Howard was standing right there. Howard would squeeze Nancy's hand under the table and whisper, "Ignore her, she'll cool off," like peace was something you could wait out. Nancy tried because she loved him and because she believed respect could be earned over time. Still, every visit ended with the same feeling in her chest, like she was a guest in a family that never planned to hand her a real seat. The envelope had been Diane's idea, and Diane had made it sound simple enough. "I'm helping your cousin with a payment," she told Howard in the kitchen earlier that day, "so I don't want it lying around in the open." Then she looked at Nancy and said, "You can put it in my office drawer since you're always organizing." Nancy had walked the envelope down the hallway and slid it into the top drawer, right beside a stack of mail and a small velvet jewelry box, and she remembered it clearly because the drawer stuck and she had to pull twice. A few minutes later, Jenna, the sister-in-law who smiled sweetly and watched like a hawk, passed by the office and said, "Oh, you're in there?" like it was suspicious to breathe near Diane's things. Later, when Diane couldn't find the envelope, Jenna's eyes lit up with certainty and she murmured to an aunt, "I knew it," loud enough for Nancy to hear. By the time dinner started, the story had already grown legs, and Nancy was walking into a room that had decided who she was. Diane didn't ask questions like she wanted answers. She asked them like she wanted a confession. "So tell me," she said, tapping the envelope on the table, "where did it go, Nancy?" When Nancy opened her mouth to explain, Diane cut her off with a sharp laugh and said, "Please, don't give me those little rehearsed speeches." Howard finally spoke, voice controlled but strained. "Mom, slow down, Nancy wouldn't do that." Diane snapped her head toward him and said, "You only say that because you don't want to admit you married wrong." Then she turned back to Nancy and added, "I warned Howard about you from the beginning and I was right, because you brought nothing into this family except soft eyes and empty hands." Nancy felt heat rise into her cheeks, not from guilt, but from the way everybody sat there letting it happen, as if Diane's confidence made the accusation true. Even Mark, Howard's father, stared down at his plate and said nothing, and that silence stung more than the words. Nancy didn't scream or cry, because she'd learned that emotion was the only thing Diane respected enough to weaponize. Instead, she placed her napkin down carefully and said, "I put the envelope where you told me to put it," keeping her voice steady even as her hands started to tremble. Diane leaned forward and said, "And yet it disappeared after you touched it," like that was the end of the conversation. Howard pushed his chair back a little and whispered, "Nancy," as if he wanted her to just endure it like usual, but Nancy could feel something shifting inside her. Quiet, firm, and tired of being used as the family's easiest target. She thought of the bills she had covered without bragging, the sacrifices she made so Howard could breathe, and the nights she sat with him planning a future his family pretended she didn't help build. Jenna lifted her phone and said, "Should we call someone?" with fake concern, and Nancy noticed something small that others missed. Jenna's eyes kept flicking toward the hallway, like she was nervous about what might be seen. Nancy looked at the office door, then back at Diane and said calmly, "Before we accuse anyone else, let's make sure we're not misunderstanding what actually happened." Nancy kept her voice low, but it landed like a clean bell in the silence. "If you truly believe I took $2,000, then let's do this the right way," she said, looking from Diane to Howard and back again. Diane let out a tight laugh. "Oh, now you want rules," she scoffed as if fairness was an insult. Howard swallowed and said, Mom, if there's even a chance you're wrong, we need to check before we say things we can't take back. Mark finally lifted his head and murmured, Diane, let her speak. If it's in the house, we'll find it. Nancy nodded once and added, we check the office drawer, the trash and the camera history in the hallway, and we do it together so no one can twist what they see. Diane pushed back from the table like she hated the idea of walking anywhere without being in control, but she stood anyway, chin high. Nancy walked ahead calmly, not rushing, not begging, and that calm made Jenna fidget behind them like a loose button. In the office, Diane yanked the drawer open and started shifting papers with quick, angry hands, muttering, this is ridiculous, while her bracelets clinked like they were applauding her outrage. Nancy didn't touch anything, she just watched, then quietly said, the drawer looks different from earlier. Someone moved the mail stack to the left. Jenna immediately said, people are always in and out of here, and her voice came out too fast. Howard stared at the drawer and asked, Jenna, why were you in here after Nancy? Jenna blinked hard and replied, I wasn't. But her eyes jumped toward the hallway like she was checking whether the house itself was listening. Mark stepped into the doorway and pointed toward the small camera in the corner where the hallway met the living room. That thing records movement, he said, sounding tired of the whole performance, and it saves clips for a while. Diane's shoulders stiffened and she snapped, Mark, don't start acting like this is a police station. But Mark didn't back down. Nancy spoke gently like she was trying to keep everyone from doing something stupid. I helped you set it up when the porch lights kept triggering at night, remember? She reminded him, and Mark nodded, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Howard leaned closer and said, Mom, if you're right, this clears you, and if you're wrong, it clears Nancy. Either way, it ends tonight. Diane's mouth opened like she wanted to refuse, but the room had already moved past her permission, and that shift made her eyes sharpen with fear she didn't want anyone to see. Mark scrolled through the camera clips while everyone stood packed into the hallway, close enough for Nancy to smell Diane's perfume and hear Jenna's quick breathing. Timestamp is right after you put it away, Mark said, tapping the screen, and he turned the phone so they could all see. The clip played, grainy but clear enough. The office door opened, a figure stepped inside, and the figure's wrist flashed with a chunky bracelet as they reached into the drawer. Howard's face tightened as the person pulled out the envelope and slid it into a purse, moving fast like someone who already knew where everything was. Diane inhaled sharply and said, that could be anyone, but her voice sounded smaller than before. Nancy didn't speak yet. She simply watched Jenna's face drain of color, and she noticed how Jenna's hand slowly curled into a fist, as if she could crush the video by squeezing the air. Jenna forced a laugh that didn't match her eyes. That camera makes everyone look the same, she said, then quickly added, Nancy was in here first, so maybe she, but Howard cut in sharper now. Stop, he said, voice rising just enough to crack the false calm. The bracelet in the video is the exact bracelet you wore to dinner. Diane looked at Jenna's wrist like she was seeing it for the first time, and for a second the confident mother-in-law expression flickered. Jenna tugged her sleeve down too late and whispered, this is insane, like insanity was the only defense left. Nancy finally spoke, slow and steady. No one has to guess, she said, eyes on the phone, because the camera keeps recording and the truth doesn't get tired, people do. Mark nodded and said, play the next clip, and the hallway held its breath like the house was about to choose a side. Mark hit play again, and the next clip showed Jenna walking briskly from the office toward the downstairs bathroom, her purse pressed tight against her side like she was guarding a heartbeat. A minute later she came out with the same quick steps, smoothing her hair, glancing around and forcing a smile at a passing cousin as if nothing had happened. Mark paused the video and looked at Jenna directly. Why would you take it to the bathroom? He asked, voice low and disappointed. Jenna's lips parted but nothing clean came out. Diane's face twisted as she tried to hold her authority together. Jenna, tell them this is some misunderstanding, she demanded, but the demand sounded less like confidence and more like panic. Howard stepped forward and said, open your purse, and when Jenna clutched it tighter, Nancy felt the last doubt in the hallway die quietly. Jenna shook her head fast. I don't have to do that, she snapped, then immediately softened her tone like she remembered she was being watched. Everyone is ganging up on me right now. Diane jumped in, eager to regain control, and said, exactly, this is turning into a witch hunt. But Mark held his hand up. No, he said, what happened at that table was a witch hunt. His eyes flicked to Nancy as he spoke, and the apology in his face was small but real. Howard kept his gaze on Jenna and repeated, "Open your purse," slower this time like he was giving her one last chance to stay human. Jenna's eyes darted to Diane, searching for rescue, and Diane's mouth tightened because she didn't know how to rescue someone the camera had already named. Nancy stayed silent, but her calm was loud in the narrow hallway. Jenna's shoulders sagged and she unzipped the purse with shaky fingers, as if the zipper itself was accusing her. She pulled out a few harmless things first. Lip gloss, keys, receipts, trying to make the moment feel less serious, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Then from the side pocket she slid out the envelope, now slightly bent, and for a second she held it like she wanted it to disappear. Diane stared at it, frozen, and her cheeks flushed a deep red that crawled up to her temples. Howard took the envelope gently, opened it and counted quickly, his face hardening with every bill. $2,000, he said, voice flat. Exactly. Jenna whispered, "I was going to put it back," but the words were weak and nobody in that hallway could pretend they meant anything. Diane turned on Jenna so fast it almost looked like relief. "How could you do this in my house?" she hissed, and Jenna flinched like a child caught stealing candy. "I did it for us," Jenna blurted, and the desperation in her voice made everyone go still again. "You always say Howard is blind," she continued, looking at Diane, "and you always say Nancy is using him, so I thought, if she looked guilty you'd finally push her out." Howard's eyes widened. Like he couldn't believe the ugliness had been spoken out loud. Mark's jaw clenched and he said, "So you framed her," like he needed the words to be real before he could react to them. Jenna wiped her face and tried to justify it. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said, but it had, because Diane had taken the lie and ran with it like it was her favorite sport. The hallway felt smaller than ever, packed with shame that didn't belong to Nancy, yet had been thrown at her anyway. Diane's eyes finally slid to Nancy, and for the first time all night her voice didn't have that sharp, proud edge. "Nancy, she started, but the sentence collapsed before it could become an apology. Howard stepped between them, not blocking Nancy but standing with her, and that simple move hit the room harder than any shouting could. "Mom," he said, controlled but wounded, "you called my wife useless in front of everyone and you didn't even hesitate." Diane's lips trembled and she whispered, "I thought I knew," as if assumptions were the same as truth. Nancy exhaled slowly, then said softly but clearly, "You didn't know. You decided." They all walked back toward the dining room, and the house felt different now, like the walls had heard the truth and refused to hold the lie again. When they stepped in, the cousins and aunts were still gathered around the table, and the moment they saw Mark's face and Jenna's trembling hands, the air changed into a tense, watching silence. Diane tried to move first, straightening her shoulders as if posture could fix what had already been said, but her eyes kept darting to the envelope in Howard's hand. "Everyone, this is being handled," she announced too loudly, and it sounded like a woman trying to grab back control that had slipped through her fingers. Howard didn't raise his voice, but he didn't soften it either when he said, "No, Mom, everyone heard the accusation, so everyone should hear the truth." Nancy stayed steady beside him, then quietly added, "I won't be whispered about after tonight, so yes, everyone will hear it." Mark set his phone on the table and said, "The camera shows Jenna took the envelope," and a low wave of shock moved through the room like a slow gust of wind. Jenna shook her head, tears building, and whispered, "I didn't mean for it to become all this," but the sentence sounded small compared to the damage it carried. Diane turned toward the crowd with a strained expression and said, "This family doesn't need to turn on itself," as if the family had not already turned on Nancy without hesitation. An aunt murmured, "So Nancy didn't take anything," and a cousin replied, "Then why did Diane say it like she was certain?" Howard looked directly at his mother and asked, "Do you want to correct what you said, or do you want to pretend you never said it?" Diane swallowed hard, then finally faced Nancy and said, "I owe you an apology," but even that sounded like it hurt her pride to admit. Nancy didn't smile at the apology, and she didn't reject it either. She just reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder she had carried for months without thinking she would ever need to defend her character. Diane's eyes narrowed immediately and she asked, "What is that?" Like proof itself was an insult. Nancy opened the folder and placed 2 papers on the table with careful hands, then said, "This is the receipt for the property tax payment that kept a lien from hitting this house last fall." Mark's eyebrows rose and he stared at the paper as if it had changed the way he understood his own life, while Diane whispered, "That wasn't you, even though her voice lacked conviction. Howard's head turned sharply toward Nancy and he said, "You did that." And Nancy answered calmly, "Yes, because you were stressed and your mother didn't want anyone knowing she was behind." Then Nancy added, quieter but firm, "So when you say I brought nothing, Diane, you're not just wrong, you're comfortable being wrong when it costs me." The room erupted into overlapping reactions, not screaming but stunned voices piling on top of each other as people tried to fit the new truth into the old story they liked better. An uncle leaned forward and said, "Diane, is that true?" And Diane's lips pressed together so tightly it looked like she was holding back a whole storm. Jenna, red-eyed and shaky, blurted, "She thinks she's so perfect." But Mark snapped, "Stop talking," and the sharpness in his tone made Jenna flinch because he had finally picked a side. Howard's brother Eric, who had been quiet all night, stared at Jenna and asked, "You did this to Nancy on purpose?" And Jenna whispered, "I thought I was protecting us," as if cruelty could be called loyalty when it wore the right mask. Diane tried to salvage dignity by saying, "I didn't ask Nancy to do anything," but Mark replied, "You benefited from it, Diane, and you still humiliated her." Nancy watched Diane's face crumble in slow motion, and she realized the reversal wasn't just the camera. It was the family finally being forced to see her as real. Nancy waited until the voices settled, then spoke in a tone so calm it made everyone lean in without even realizing it. "I'm not here to punish anyone," she said, looking around the table, "but I am here to end the pattern where I'm blamed because it's convenient." Diane tried again, softer this time, "Nancy, I was only trying to protect my son." And Nancy met her eyes and replied, "Protecting your son would have meant asking questions before making accusations." Howard placed the envelope on the table and said, "Jenna will return every dollar and she will say out loud what she did." And Eric's face tightened as he muttered, "We're leaving after this." Jenna sniffed and whispered, "I'll pay it back." But Nancy didn't even look at the envelope, she looked at the people. "After tonight," Nancy said, voice steady, "no one in this room gets to speak about me in secret again. If you have something to say, you say it to my face with the truth beside you." Jenna's voice came out thin like she had to push it through shame. "I took the envelope," she said, eyes down, "and I wanted Nancy to look guilty." The words hit the table and stayed there, heavy and undeniable. Eric stood up slowly, chair scraping the floor, and said, "So you tried to ruin my brother's marriage because you don't like his wife." Jenna looked up at him with tears and said, "I thought she was taking him away." And Eric replied, "No, your jealousy did that." Diane's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. Then she paused and looked at Nancy again, as if she was realizing for the first time that Nancy had choices. Howard didn't look proud or angry. He looked disappointed, and that disappointment carried more weight than shouting ever could. "We're done playing guessing games," Howard said quietly, "and we're done letting Mom's opinions run the house." Nancy listened and felt something inside her loosen, not because she needed revenge, but because truth had finally arrived in the room without needing her to beg for it. Mark cleared his throat and spoke to the whole table, not just to Diane. "I watched you all sit here and let Nancy be accused," he said, voice rough with guilt, "and I said nothing until the camera forced my mouth open." A cousin shifted uncomfortably and murmured, "We didn't know," but Mark answered, "You didn't want to know because it was easier to assume." Diane opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she was learning that confidence doesn't equal correctness. Howard's Aunt Linda looked at Nancy and said, "I'm sorry," and it sounded real because it didn't come with excuses. Nancy nodded once, accepting the apology without performing gratitude like she owed it. He didn't. Howard reached for Nancy's hand and squeezed, and that small gesture made it clear to everyone watching that the marriage wasn't up for family votes anymore. Diane's face tightened when she saw that and she whispered, "Howard, I'm still your mother." And Howard answered calmly, "Yes, but Nancy is my wife and you don't get to disrespect her to prove you matter." Diane tried to regain control through softness, the way people do when loud power stops working. "Nancy," she said carefully, "I didn't mean to humiliate you." Nancy tilted her head slightly and replied, "But you did humiliate me and you meant every word at the time." The honesty made Diane blink like she wasn't used to consequences being spoken out loud. "I thought you were. I thought you didn't contribute," Diane admitted, and her voice sounded smaller than her pride. Nancy slid the second paper from the folder across the table and said, "And this is the bank transfer record from when I helped cover Howard's job gap." Howard's eyes widened again and he whispered, "You never told me it was that much." And Nancy said, "Because I wasn't trying to win, I was trying to keep us safe." Diane stared at the paper, then at Howard, then back at Nancy, and the wrong assumption she'd worn like armor finally cracked. She hadn't just judged Nancy, she had built a whole identity around underestimating her. The room went quiet in a different way this time, less dramatic, more sobering, like everyone was realizing they had treated Nancy like a visitor when she had quietly been a pillar. Eric looked at Howard and said, "Bro, you okay?" And Howard nodded slowly, then said, "I'm angry but I'm clear." He turned to Diane and spoke with steady certainty. "You don't get to test my wife's worth again," he said, "and you don't get to decide who belongs in my life based on your fear." Diane's eyes shone with frustration and embarrassment, and she tried one last time to shift blame. "Jenna shouldn't have done this," she said, and Nancy replied, "Jenna did it, but you gave her the audience." Mark leaned back and exhaled hard, then said, "Diane, the way you talk about Nancy, that's what invited this." Diane looked around the table, then down, and for the first time she didn't have a sharp comeback ready. The power dynamic had flipped, not because Nancy yelled, but because calm truth had finally stood taller than Diane's certainty. Jenna sniffed and asked, "So what happens now?" And the question sounded like she expected a quick reset, like most family messes got covered with dessert. Howard looked at her plainly and said, "You pay back every dollar and you apologize to Nancy without excuses." Eric added, "And you and I are having a long conversation about boundaries." His tone firm but not cruel. Diane opened her mouth again, but Mark cut in gently. "And Diane," he said, "you're going to apologize too, fully." Diane's throat bobbed as she swallowed, then she looked directly at Nancy, and her voice finally softened into something closer to truth. "I'm sorry," she said, "for accusing you, for speaking about you like you were less, and for not respecting what you've done." Nancy held her gaze and answered, "Thank you for saying it out loud." Then she added, steady and clear, "But an apology doesn't erase a pattern. Change does." That line didn't attack Diane. It challenged her, and everyone at the table understood the difference. Later, as coats were gathered and the room slowly loosened, Diane tried to follow Nancy into the hallway. "Nancy, please," she said, reaching out like she wanted to grab the moment before it left her behind. Nancy stopped, not trapped, not fearful, just calm. Howard stood beside her, and the three of them formed a quiet triangle where Diane could no longer talk over anyone. "I want peace," Diane said, voice trembling. "I don't want my son pulled away." Nancy nodded, understanding the fear without accepting the behavior. "Howard isn't being pulled away," Nancy said. "He's growing up and you can grow with him, or you can keep fighting a battle that doesn't exist." Howard added, "I'm not choosing between you and Nancy. I'm choosing respect." Diane's eyes glistened and she whispered, "I'll try," and Nancy replied, "Try in actions, not words." Then Nancy took Howard's hand and walked back toward the car, feeling the night air cool against her skin like a clean reset. In the car, Howard sat quietly for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dark street like he was relearning what family meant. "I'm sorry," he finally said, voice low, "for not stopping it sooner." Nancy looked at him and her expression wasn't bitter. It was resolved. "You stopped it when it mattered," she said, "but we're not living like this anymore." Howard nodded, and his eyes shone with the kind of respect that comes from seeing someone clearly for the first time. "No more dinners where you're a target," he said. "No more silence when you're being disrespected." Nancy exhaled slowly and watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror, not with triumph but with calm closure. Her phone buzzed with a message from Linda that simply said, "You didn't deserve that." And Nancy didn't reply right away because she didn't need to. She had already said the only line that mattered, the one that ended the story with dignity. "You judged me before you knew me. That was your mistake, not mine."